Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Enter Chat. Today I have Luca Spolidoro. Is that right? Did I pronounce your name
Yeah,
right?
it's
Cool. Okay.
Italian name.
Yes. I have Luca from the Entra AI Innovations team. I've worked with Luca for many years now, and Luca is always fun, knows so much about Graph, especially people working on Graph PowerShell. Luca is like he knows inside out. Like I go to him asking about OData and various queries when I'm stuck. Today we're going to talk about something special called the Model Context Protocol server that we launched, and Luca was the PM, is the PM for it. Welcome to Enter Chat, Luca.
Yeah, hey, Meryl. Very happy to be here.
Yes, so good to have you here. I should have had you on earlier, but we wanted to wait till we launched this so we can have this chat, right? Cool, awesome. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to be in the team?
Yeah. So before I was working for advanced queries, that is a part of Microsoft Graph, especially for directory objects, where you can use more advanced capabilities
Yes,
for example, filtering, counting, and
correct.
sorting objects in the directory. And and then when we had the SFI initiatives, where the team was fully concentrated on security. For me as a PM, I didn't had a lot of things to do, and
Right.
so I was finding other opportunities around, and I saw Security Copilot that was using AI to transform natural language into Microsoft Graph Query. I thought that was very interesting, and I also thought the way uh, we were doing things before was not optimal, and I had new
Nice.
ideas. So I started bugging the team, say, "Hey, can we try this? Can we try that?" I did some
Nice.
hackathon, and that's how I went into the team.
Nice. Okay. So, yeah. So, for anyone who's written in Graph PowerShell, you had to type in consistency level, eventual, and all
Eventual,
those
yeah.
headers. So, Luca knows all about it. If we have time in the end, we'll chat about that. But you worked on this whole idea of, just for context, right? So, MCP. I'm sure most of people who follow me know a little bit of what MCP is and so on. But let's talk about this whole concept, right? Like, how do you tell something in natural language, just in plain English? Like, how many users do I have in my tenant, or how many conditional access policies I enable in my tenant? You tell something in English and then get an answer which is accurate without having to write code and REST APIs and PowerShell, or all those things. So that's the concept, right? Like, how do you make it more approachable for people to work with their tenant and manage their tenant? Now, I remember you worked on this way before all this AI stuff, and way before we had MCPs, before
Yes,
LLM or
yes.
GPT even became popular. Like, this is like I think 4 years, like many years
Yeah,
back.
that was 4 years back was one of my hackathon projects where I had this idea when the first GPT 3.5 was released as an API to use that as a base to transform a natural language query into a series of Microsoft Graph call. And the first prototype, of course, was very bare bone. I was using the few shot prompt technique to help the AI to learn about Microsoft Graph APIs, to then understand OData and produce congruent Microsoft Graph APIs. At that time, we didn't even have function calling. So we could only do like one prompt, one query direct.
Yeah.
And then after function calling feature came out, then it was really the breakthrough, because with function calling, you let the AI call your transformation as many times as the AI deems necessary to satisfy the user prompt. So at that point, we were able to do intent breakdown. We
Yes.
were able to have multiple graph calls executed one after another with, for example, the input of the previous call, the output of the previous call being the input of the next call, and do some sort of chaining and all these complex things that are now exposed through an MCP server. So all the knowledge, all the experiments that we did in these past 4 years,
Yes.
now they are all in the power of the customer, and we are very happy about it.
Nice. Yeah. When I first saw your hackathon, like it was so interesting. I went and watched the video in the internal site, and I tried as well. But yes, at that time, like we didn't have access, like even the whole Microsoft Foundry and none of that existed. The LLMs were even not that great as well compared to like the newer ones, especially ones like Claude and so on. So it worked, but it wasn't like this, this aha moment of look, it's doing very complex things. Cool. Okay. So explain to us, maybe for people who are very new to this, right? What is MCP? Like it stands for Model Context Protocol. What does it really mean? And why did Microsoft build an official one for calling, into all of Graph? It's called MCP for Enterprise Server. Is that? I
Yes,
always get
yes.
the name mixed up.
So as a company, we are fully invested in the MCP protocol. You've seen GitHub releasing its own MCP, Azure releasing its own MCP, and having
Microsoft Learn
all
has an
yeah,
MCP.
Learn has MCP, and
Yeah.
then clients. So we'll have M365 Copilot being able to add MCP directly. That will be released soon. And as a company, really from our core AI team, we are fully invested, and that means that MCP is the way that we talk to AI application, to AI agents, and we want to empower AI agents to use our product. And
And
this
before
is what,
MCPs
yeah.
came, like it wasn't that intelligent, right? Like you could just chat, ask questions. It
Well,
would,
it was MCP enabled the fact that function that you could expose to an AI application or to LLM could be exposed through a third party. So before, you could have functions, but the
yeah.
function had to be written inside the AI application, and there was no way for API provider or content provider to release their own interface to their own product to other third-party applications or third-party agents.
Yeah, when I
So
first
what
used
happened?
the
Yeah.
M365 Copilot also I was able to ask questions, and I asked like, what is the maximum number of conditional access policies you can have in a tenant? And it
Mhm.
was able to find the answer, like, I
By
think it was trained
browsing,
on it. Yeah,
probably.
it got the answer. But at that time I was like, okay, this is cool. What are the policies that I have in my tenant? So I asked it because I was signed into M365. I thought, yeah, it should, in my mind it was like, yeah, it should be able to figure out. But then I realized until someone in the dev team for M365 Copilot goes and does some additional work, it was never going to be able to call into my tenant and get me things specific to my tenant. So I was like very disappointed. And I was like, okay, we have to wait for someone at Microsoft to write and, add the feature to M365 Copilot. And then I thought like, that means like third party LLM. If I like Claude, if I like ChatGPT, there's no way they would be even be able to connect, and like it felt very complicated. So I sort of
That's
gave up
right.
on that when I first, 2 years ago when all this started. So it felt to me like, okay, LLMs are good. They're a bit of toys to just ask questions and maybe format English, make your, when you're writing emails, make it more polished and things like that. So that was where I put them at the beginning. But then things changed, right? With MCPs, as you're saying.
Yeah, LLM by themselves, they're great at language stuff, but when you couple them with functions that can do actions, MCP became the de facto standard. The AI community really took on the standard, and there are already thousands, tens of thousands actually, of MCP servers out there that any MCP client that follows the latest standard can connect to. And our MCP server, of course, follows the latest standard for OAuth and authentication. We want to give the power to the admins to choose if they want to enable this, because we understand that there are some concern, of course, giving access of the tenant data to random LLMs. And so we want to have the admins to really decide and have granular control or which kind of data is the MCP server allowed to access, which kind of operation they would like to access, and so on. So we
So
really designed this system to be fully controllable and fully auditable and secure, of course.
nice. Yeah. So that brings in all of the governance and mitigation, right? You can safely use and deploy MCPs for Microsoft and the Microsoft Enterprise in the tenant, but have a lot of governance over who can access what LLMs or
Absolutely.
what apps can be used and etc. So before we come into that, how does the MCP server work? Because I know you've done some smarts. It's more than your average MCP that people might find for the MCP server for enterprise. The one that uses Graph. Can you tell us like what does a standard MCP do? How does it work? And then tell us about the special sauce that you included in the version that's coming from Microsoft.
Yes. So a standard MCP usually have a lot of tools that are specific with a certain operation. And these tools are functions that have parameters, and the LLM would need to first pick the tool, fill out the parameters, and then the tool goes
So
and yeah,
what happens? Let's say I ask a question, right? Let's take an example. Like if I ask, how many conditional access policies do I have in my tenant, right? So that's my prompt.
yeah.
Can you
So
explain
so
like how it works with
for
MCP?
a normal MCP server, that would need to choose the conditional access count or list tool. And then with that, the conditional access tool would execute a Microsoft Graph API that has in its code, its own code that is programmed manually,
Yeah,
and then return the response to the AI that might not be optimized for the actual question, because you ask the count, but if the available tool was only the list one, then it would return the entire list, and then the poor LLM had to count by itself how many
yeah,
are there.
yeah.
Um,
And it would waste tokens as well, right? Like,
Absolutely waste tokens there. But the problem is that with Surface like Microsoft Graph APIs,
yes.
you will have an explosion of tools and various parameters that will definitely get the LLM confused. In
Yeah, there are
fact,
like, I think how many APIs does Graph have? It's very hard to count. It's
thousands,
like
yeah.
gazillions.
And it also depends on how granular would you expose your tools. I think the GitHub MCP server has something around 84 tools. The Azure MCP server has 174 tools.
Wow. Yeah.
So those are already like over the 128 recommended limit
Limit.
for
Right.
choosing the correct set.
Because every time
And
I ask a question, when you use with MCP, what happens is the client, right? If I go into like VS Code or Cloud Desktop and ask like this question, it sends my question to the LLM. And because the agent is dumb, right? It is just like sending stuff to the LLM in the sense the client. So I ask a question, it sends that question as well as all the tool, that entire list of all the tools is sent to the
with all the
LLM.
descriptions that
Correct.
are in
And
the
that's
context
long.
window. So
Right.
many of the MCP servers today would cut into your context window for the LLM
Yeah.
almost by half. And
Right.
so to the LLM to respond, only has half of the context window to actually reason and produce a response to you.
So Graph, so in that way,
Well,
Graph, it was out of the question to like have all the Graph APIs individually as a tool because like I think we'll just finish the context window itself, just
yeah,
sending the
yeah,
Graph list of APIs.
and really, realistically, over a certain amount of tools, the LLM is not able today to really discern which one is the best one for picking the right one and filling out the right parameters and so on. And we've seen this very issue in Security Copilot, because Security Copilot will have not just the tools for Entra, will have the the skills they're called there for Sentinel, for Defender, and so and the customer can even add their own custom tools over their own custom skills. And they had to pick among like 700 of them, and they had to build a custom orchestrator to really go
Interesting.
and pick the right tool, because the LLM itself was too confused to choose among the 700
Right. Yeah.
ones. So how did we solve this? We solved all of this with just 3 tools. So by using something called few shot prompting, we can use intent extraction from the customer question plus the chat eventual that it has to have the LLM really understand what is the question that the customer is asking, and formatted in a kind of normalized way. So if I were to ask, how many users do I have in my tenant? The extracted intent will be count the number of users. That's it. And then we take that phrase and we use embeddings to compare with semantic similarity on a database of samples that our product team, our API teams are maintaining with the extracted intent, so our retrieval text, and the corresponding Microsoft Graph query to satisfy that intent. So in this case, the count number of user will get referred to the user/$count query. And then we
Right.
return to the LLM the top 5 most similar intent by semantic similarity. And at this point, the LLM reasoned, because we know that retrieval, our RAG, the retrieval augmented generation, is not reasoning. So we get the opportunity for the LLM to go through the examples, see which one is fitting the best, and come up with its own. So we do have some parameters in these examples that we return. We might not have the full list of properties that we want to select, but the LLM can reason through that and say, oh, look, this example is the one that is the most appropriate. Oh, but I need to add this property that
Right.
I know, because the LLM is pre-trained on Microsoft Graph documentation, knows roughly the Microsoft Graph schema. It knows OData very well. We use that pre-trained knowledge to help when something is missing in our RAG, in our database of examples. And then we also have the third tool that is helping the LLM to explore the current Microsoft Graph schema to get a list of, for example, properties for an entity or the properties of a complex properties, to really understand what kind of items may be missing if the RAG examples are not good enough. So we have that covered too.
Right. Okay. So that's a lot of magic sauce in there.
Yes,
And that's why it
and it's
can.
patented, this system.
Cool.
So
Nice.
yeah,
So that is why it is able to figure out what API is useful than just being given the whole graph API and then, it trying out on its own based on the training that it had before. You are now augmenting that with,
absolutely. And that was you were using with Loka, right? With
yes,
Loka, you were allowing the LLM to come up with the
correct.
query by itself, but the shortcomings of those, that all the new APIs that were after the knowledge cutoff
Yes.
were
Yeah,
not present.
correct.
Uh, there was something in the documentation that frankly was too detailed or too nuanced for the LLM
Correct.
to
Yeah.
understand,
Yeah.
while we as API owner, we know best what are the optimization and what are the most efficient way to execute a query. And so
Exactly.
all these things are added into the LLM grounding knowledge, so that the LLM can pick the best and generate the best query for the
Eh,
question.
100%. Yeah. So that way, and if you, in your, that rag that you have of all the existing stuff, you're continuously updating it, right? And expanding it,
Absolutely. Yes.
today, does it work for everything like Intune to other
So
services?
today we do have a focus on Entra APIs. We already have Intune APIs there, but they're only in our dev environment to finish testing. We would like to import Intune. We would like to import Windows Autopatch and all the other workload from
Nice.
Microsoft Graph. They would need to sign off, of course, that to be on MCP Server because we would like to give the power of choosing to expose their APIs to AI agents to the workload themselves. We, as Entra and Micrograph, we always need to ask for permission
Yes. Yeah.
to expose stuff for AI agents because not all APIs are AI ready.
Correct. Yeah.
There are
Yeah.
certain APIs that might be okay, for scripts and normal application. They are okay to, for example, download a lot of data and do filter at client
Yeah.
side, but
Yeah.
this is absolutely not sufficient for an AI. We had some experiments and tests back then. We were trying to send 50 users in the context window with all the properties selected. And if you know a little bit on graph, you know that the user object has a lot of properties, very verbose. It has all the details for the license assigned to the user, a lot of IDs in its schema. So even just 50 users is going over the context window of GPT 4.0, that is 128K tokens. But for GPT 4.1 that has 1 million tokens context window, it was okay. And then we want to see with all this JSON that we put in there, if it was able to count how many users were there without the OData count property. And we had disastrous results
Yeah.
because the LLM was really confused on the JSON format, on all the
Right.
parentheses open and
Yeah. Where
close,
does the user
and
start? One user
yeah,
finish and the
exactly.
other
When
user
one
start.
start, when the other end. And so, like, we had results that were saying after giving 50 users that were 3 users in the
Right.
tenant or something like that. So we really need to be careful on the API quality to be able to provide good answer because one of the biggest detractors that we might have is that if a customer will ask a question and then maybe we come up with the right query, but then the data is too much and the LLM can interpret it in a not even a very good way and returns an answer that is not correct.
Yeah, it's better to not get an answer than get an incorrect answer, right? It's better to say the
Exactly.
MCP is, it can't give that answer. And today, the way you control it is through permissions, right? You're curating what permissions you're exposing, and
Yes.
then that means you're reviewing the APIs as they come on board, doing all that work to do the RAG and improve that. So it's not just like throwing together an existing set of APIs and just giving people, hey, here's my MCP,
Yeah,
which is what the open source version of the MCP did. It just gave all access to the API, which can result in it's good as a toy to try and test things, but not something you can really rely on when
absolutely.
you're building
And
things.
and that is even more important when we are going to enable a write operations because for now we only support get calls, but we are working today. Well, not today because almost Thanksgiving.
Yes.
As soon as Thanksgiving finish, we will start working on write operations to provide a good level of confidence for the customer that when they ask to add users to a group or create new users and do these kind of batch operations, those are all executed reliably. And we are concerned a little bit for operation that would involve hundreds of objects because the LLM would have to generate each individual call to then get executed. And so we are also thinking of implementing something called code execution that Anthropic recently released as a part of the MCP standard, where you could make the LLM generate a script instead and then the script will call the MCP tools. So in this way, we will give the power to do for loops, to do joins that are complex for an LLM to really understand if you have a lot of data,
Complex
and
and the token, right? Like when there's a lot of
for
data.
avoiding all the token issues and limitations that we are currently facing. Now, the LLM today have, like the newer model, have 200,000 tokens, context windows. Some of them have 1 million, 2 million context window. And we know that 6 months, 1 year, we will have infinite LLM, like context windows LLM. But today, we have to deal with this, and we really don't know
Yeah,
what
we don't
the
know how it
future would
will
bring.
evolve, right? Whether it will plateau at
But
some token
yeah, so
size, and there's time as well. Like you have to wait for all that. Like a simple example is I was thinking, what are the ways we can replace PowerShell, right? So I was like, whenever something I had to do, I was like, let me use MCP for this. So I tried initially things like adding my version of the graph MCP and then adding an MCP that could write to the file system. And I said, get all my users and create a CSV, because that's a very common admin
yeah,
task,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like creating various reports with, various properties and writing it to a CSV. That failed miserably because it has to, like, all the queries, the data has to go back to the LLM, and then the LLM has to call the other MCP and then write it. And even with a small tenant with 30, 50 users, it would like take forever, and it was not really reliable at all because the LLM is sitting in the middle and everything is going back and forth, right? Like
Yes,
every user
yes. But
object
we
and
have
all the
a solution
properties. Yeah.
also for this one, because you are talking about now generating PowerShell scripts, and the system that we architected that would return to the LLM Microsoft Graph call can be tweaked to, instead of returning Microsoft HTTP endpoint, can return PowerShell commandlet. So you may have noticed that in Graph Explorer, you can have any call with the various code snippets that you see. So you have the HTTP endpoint, the C# SDK, PowerShell SDK, and so
Yeah.
on. We are using the same system that converts automatically an HTTP endpoint to a PowerShell SDK to have this experiment under the hood that I can't wait to release,
Nice.
where we could generate entire PowerShell scripts for the customer to just copy paste and use in their own environment. And this will be grounded with all the work that we already did for the HTTP APIs. So this will be really a minimal effort for us to enable this, and I think it will be a very good value added for customers.
Nice. Yeah, it'll be very useful because like half the time, a lot of us admin spend is converting from the REST API ways to PowerShell and doing the whole splitting and all this back and forth sort of thing, trying to understand PowerShell for people who are new to PowerShell. Yeah, that will be really cool to see that coming through. Let's take a quick pause to talk about AppGov's Score from eNow Software, as seen on EntraChat. If manually managing risky apps in Entra ID feels overwhelming, this free tool gives you instant visibility into your app risk profile. In minutes, you'll get a benchmark score and insights across 24 key checks, plus a free 7-day upgrade to identify specific governance gaps to take action on immediately. So take the stress out of keeping Entra secure. Visit appgovscore.com and click Try for free. That's appgovscore.com. Cool. So let's jump into the admin side, right? Like now my devs asking to use the MCP. Before we come into that, just for the release that is there in public preview today, you cannot use any MCP client, right? Like the promise of MCP is you have an MCP server and you can plug it into any LLM or desktop client that works with the MCP protocol. So that means there is Cloud Desktop, is even M365 Copilot or Cursor and VS Code and various sorts of clients could be used. People use, the CLI as well, like Gemini, using Gemini CLI to call an MCP and so on. So there are various clients, etc., that are supported. But the MCP server that's in public preview right now doesn't allow any client, right?
Yes, so the biggest restriction that we have today is that we don't support the dynamic client registration, that is a DCR. And dynamic client registration is a feature where the MCP client would automatically get registered into the Entra tenant with a set of permissions where the admin really didn't have full control over
Y-
it.
Yeah, and
So
that means who just heard you say that go like, what? Some
exactly. So
MCP is going to add a
Entra
new app into my tenant without
really
even.
decided not to support this standard and instead to support another standard that is probably going to replace that. Is called client ID metadata. So with that standard, we will be able to have a more secure environment and have the opportunity to register ad hoc these clients. So today, what you will need to have is to, first of all, register an app on your own tenant. Give
So just
that
before
app.
we get into that, right? So the way the current world works with DCR and, Chat Claude and, all the other things that support them, when a user is using a new MCP, like just at runtime, like even VS Code supports it with various other MCPs, just not for this one. Or Entra doesn't, right? It's more like an Entra thing than that. So when someone uses an MCP that needs to auth, just when I add the MCP and I sign in, it goes and creates a new app in the tenant and then asks for whatever the permissions, etc., that's needed, and that gets dynamically added, and it works that way. So that is the typical flow. Every new MCP, and I think even a new instance of an MCP that you configure in VS Code, let's take VS Code as one example, it would create like a new client ID and a thing on the enterprise server. That's how you sort of differentiate, and you would see it show
Yeah,
up
and you would need
Firebase
admin consent, of course, to create these applications.
to add them. So
So
tell us what you did. What is there with VS? That's not there, right? So it's not supported by Intra, the DCR, Dynamic Client Registration Protocol, or even the newest CAMD one is not supported by Intra yet. So today with Entra for this MCP, people will still continue doing what they already know about how to manage clients and give permissions to
absolutely.
resources. Yeah, yeah. If you can explain
So
that
there are two main ways. One is special for Visual Studio Code because Visual Studio Code has a particular handling on Entra authorization and authentication. So with Visual Studio Code, you could provision the the app ID of Visual Studio Code in your tenant. At this point, your tenant knows about Visual Studio Code, and you could associate the permissions of the MCP server, the one that you want to grant, to the Visual Studio Code app that is there, actually the service principal that is now registered in your tenant. And after you do that, you can add the MCP, configure the MCP server in Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code recognize that is already present in the tenant. And so it would continue the login flow normally. While for ChatGPT or Claude, you actually need to specify a client ID, an alternative client ID. And that alternative client ID could be a new application registration that you
it's
are
like a
doing in your
custom app
tenant.
that I
Yeah,
add
a
to my
custom app,
tenant.
or
Yeah,
you can reuse an application that you already have with adding two things. One is the reply URL specific to a ChatGPT or Claude, and of course the permissions for the MCP server that are different from the permission to Graph. And they are different in sort of they have a prefix
yeah.
MCP
That's
dot.
the interesting
Yeah,
thing. Like, why is that? Why couldn't I just say directory.read.all and
yeah,
there were all
and
these graph
MCP dot
permissions, right?
access,
Why is
right?
now there are
Yes,
new permissions
yes.
call
Okay, so
mcp.directory.read and mcp.user.read and all that.
we wanted to go with that route. First, we wanted to have the standard graph permissions, and then only a new permission to access MCP. Like, we didn't choose that for two reasons. One, it's technical, is because our login system still doesn't support sending the scope that one is for graph, one is for MCP, to one application that is our MCP server, because our MCP server would need these two scopes, would need the graph scopes and the MCP scopes to be present, and that are called audiences. So our login system still doesn't support sending multiple audiences to a single application. And the second reason that is actually more practical is because we would like the tenant admin to really choose if they are gonna to use an application that they already have, that have granted graph permission, not to give broad access to everything they have, but we wanted the admin to really say, okay, this is a new thing. I shouldn't really just allow NCP for in its totality, but I need to think and sit through and decide which granular scopes I can give to the application to satisfy like the least privilege principles and so on.
Because so that one, if you didn't have that, if I had, say, for example, I had a Salesforce app or some other app, and I had given it user.read.all and various permissions for that app to work. If you didn't introduce this new MCP, then whoever wrote the code, they could potentially call the MCP access to the MCP, right?
If you just add the MCP.access to that application, they could call MCP on all the graph permissions.
All the endpoints that they already have permission.
They already had permission for.
As the admin, you didn't really consent to that when you initially gave it permissions, right? So now there's a lot more granular control for admins to decide there is MCP and I'm only going to give certain apps access to it. Just because they previously had user.read for the app doesn't mean they can use that with MCP
server. Because you need to understand that everything goes through an LLM. And we know that many admins are not okay with this. So maybe they will be okay if the list of apps are going through an LLM, but not the list of users, because the list of users can contain PIIs and so on.
Yeah, like if I have PowerShell, right, and I'm using PowerShell which has a lot of permissions already, and if it was just that other way where I just gave one MCP permission scope to PowerShell client, then suddenly now it can call all the permissions that were already granted to PowerShell, which you as the admin it was not the intent when you gave, the PowerShell access and that to that client. Cool. Okay. So that makes sense. So it's not like it's just enabled in all tenants and everyone can start using MCPs.
The admin
has to
consciously. So first of all, you need to purposely provision the MCP server service principal in your tenant. And that would grant the permission of associating permission to another app. And then you are going to create your own app or provision Visual Studio Code to then associate those permissions.
Okay, so there's a lot more control than something that a lot of admins say, like, oh, this got turned on in my tenant and I need to do
know
work.
It's not plug and play, right? We know it requires a little bit of thinking, and we know that this friction would not increase our usage so much, but we really thought through it. We prefer to make more secure on the safe side, not to enable this by default, not to surprise any admin with access that they didn't grant. The operation to enable MCP are straightforward. At the server, at the client, associate the permissions, and they have full control. That was utmost important
Cool.
for us.
Right. And so all of this, getting the permission, granting it, and then the admin can also decide, can they decide who of their users can use MCP?
So on that, we need to test. Probably can, because you can consent for not all principal, but for, can give the output permission
Okay.
grants to certain users.
But I think if you're an admin, if you do an admin
Yeah,
consent, it's for
yeah,
all.
yeah, yeah. But I don't know if a user can ask for permission today. We would like to have this granular control where you also have incremental consent. So maybe you start with just the basic permission, and then as soon as you start asking questions, if you don't have permission to ask that question, you will get a prompt saying, okay, ask your admin to grant consent for you specifically for this scope, so that next time you will be able to uh,
Yeah.
get
And
consent.
today, if admins want to do like one group of users, one permission for MCPs versus another group,
And
today for
they
VS
can
Code,
use
they can just,
conditional access.
and they can create custom apps, right? Like they can say,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Also,
this app
yes,
has these permissions and I'll give to,
absolutely. Yes.
my IT team, which might have a lot more versus to some dev team or like some custom app or another agent. I will like, create a different app and then give the permissions scoped only to that app. And then also go to users, blade for that service principal, and then limit who can use
Yeah,
that
and they can
service
also use
principal.
conditional access for establishing who
Oh,
can
nice.
access
Yeah,
the
because these
MCP
apps will
server.
show up in
Yeah,
the app that they
in the
create will show up in
resource. Yes.
conditional access. And
Yeah,
yeah, that's even better, right? You can say use it only within this network and so on. So you have a lot more visibility. And then logging, all of that is included. I saw in the very first page itself, all like the audit logs, what gets logged, how
absolutely.
it's
Yes.
logged is all included in there. So you can monitor for that. Cool. Nice. So there's lots for admins compared to Learn MCP. I have no control. Anyone can use it and access it. So with this MCP server, there's a lot that the admins have control over and choose how they want to allow it within their tenant when it comes to, this usage. Now, Security Copilot also has this feature, right, where I can ask a question and it'll give the answer. Is it calling your same MCP when that happens? When I ask, because
Not
a lot
yet.
of people will get this E5
Yes.
license and now suddenly they can go to Security
Yes.
Copilot and ask questions and they're like, oh, I don't want this hassle of, doing all this VS Code and setting it all up. I just want to open the browser and, ask a
Hmm.
question. I have, now that they have E5, which gives SCP compute and so on, can I just use that? Is it going to be using your new MCP
Yes,
server?
so we have planned to rationalize all of our integrations with the Security Copilot, because before we had to add code in the Security Copilot code base to do all of this operation, and it was kind of duplication. Now that we have the protocol that allows us to hold our part of the code and be separated with the Security Copilot itself, we will do that because it's much more efficient. It will allow us to iterate more quickly. And yes, so the answer is yes, definitely. Customers can go with Security Copilot and use the same feature that our MCP server has. We will expose the similar features in the Entra portal with the embedded chat. And now the difference will be, why would I use Security Copilot if I can also have the MCP server for free, because our MCP server is free.
You still need to pay for VS Code or GitHub Copilot. You need
Yeah,
to
but
pay a
it
little.
also that
Yeah,
is there is a free tier
yeah,
there
yeah.
where
There's
customer can
so many
try
tokens. Like
out.
this, something like what you're speaking today. Anyone can go to their tenant and use VS Code
Yes,
in your dev
yes,
tenant. Like I would say, every admin should 100% try it in their
right,
dev tenant.
absolutely.
Because this is a big part of what I see the future of a lot of the admin work that will happen. And there's no cost, right? Like VS Code, GitHub Copilot, just with the free tier, I think there's a daily token limit, like they give for free. So you can just go in and set this up, try asking questions, and it works. But the more you ask, it'll hit the limit for the day, and then
Yes.
you need to pay. But paying also is like, what is it, $15 a month, I think? Something like that.
Yes, that is
Yeah.
very little. But my point that it was wanted to do earlier is that with Security Copilot and Entra Copilot, you will have a full embedded solution that is not just talk with MCP. You will
Correct.
have also other MCP that will be fully integrated into the chat, like the MS Learn MCP that
Yeah.
could be used as fallback when you ask questions about how do I do things in the Entra portal.
Yeah.
The Learn MCP could also be used to browse the current documentation to come up with new
The
queries
new
as
queries. Yeah.
well.
And
We will have,
Sentinel and other things as well, right?
yes,
And also, like when you ask a question, there are better ways than always graph. Like if you can do a KQL and get to that same data,
yes,
like you can query and do various snazzy things, which in graph you'll be like writing a massive script to do. And in Copilot it's all integrated, so it can pick up the best thing to
yes.
answer your question and get you the answer, like a lot faster than giving up, or taking a long time with just
Yeah,
only graph.
Graph MCP is just a part of the piece that we want to enable with the AI integration in Entra is the fundamental part because only with Graph you can do writes. You
Yeah,
cannot use KQL, you cannot
correct.
use any
Yes.
other thing.
Yeah.
So that's why we started with Graph. We started and trying to make that very, very reliable and solid so that we could add all the other parts to really have a complete system to chat and use agents. Because frankly, chat is
Yeah.
just the initial scenario.
Yes. Yeah.
We would like to have full-blown agents that are going to create actions and take basically replace the admin jobs for all these kind of complex operations.
Yes. I would rephrase it as like taking away mundane things, right? Like when
Yes,
I when
let's
I
say
was
that.
working as an admin, right? Like we would do an MFA rollout, and then the stakeholders would come and ask, like, okay, I want a daily report of, how many people have registered, how many people have this thing, then like various different things, and send me this report. Because when they did this big launch and they want to know that, oh, they're doing a passkey rollout, and they want to know who hasn't set up the initial prerequisites before they start enforcing. And then every day, like you need to, as an admin, go, maybe you write a script and just, run it and take that and send it to them. And like then they might ask some other question about, oh, why is this group this and why is this other user that? You can now use an agent can eventually do a lot of those mundane tasks, like
Absolutely.
just
Yes.
reporting to people and so on. And then you're free to think and do the actual admin work of enabling and securing the tenant and things like routine things which didn't really add value to your work. I feel a lot of that you can, in this future world, you can get done a lot faster. Like even now, things that took so long in PowerShell, etc., to do with LLM, it gives me at least a good starting script, and then I can refine it because it doesn't always get it right. Like it can just do parts of it. So for me, that's where I see a lot of this value of moving, all these basic things out to other admins, to other like agents and LLMs in the future, so we can focus more on, okay, my conditional access policies itself is a mess, right? How do I make it better? Things like that,
Yeah,
I
for
think.
that we have specific agents that are
Yeah,
targeted on, for example,
correct. That
specific
will help.
conditional access policies.
Yeah,
But um, as the LLMs would get smarter and smarter, the cool thing about this MCP server is that it's not restricting the LLM to really think through which queries are possible and how to build the next steps. we feel that as the LLM progress into intelligence and expanded the token limits with the same MCP server that we have today, they will
Yeah.
be able to do even more
More,
complex
more
and greater
reasoning,
things. Yes.
etc. Right with that. Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Awesome. So what's your one takeaway like to everyone on the MCPs? Like what should someone do? Like they've heard this, what's the next thing they should do if they're really keen
So
on
yeah,
trying it out?
definitely go to the GitHub MCP registry and install the MCP server, provision that in your demo tenant, if you have demo tenant, and play around with questions. Try to understand the limitations because Microsoft Graph has limitation, LLM has limitations. So it's not that we can do everything, but the admins get a good grasp of what's possible, then starts building and make your life easier and makes your job easier.
Nice. And yeah, demo tenant is what you can do today, but because this is an official server from
Yeah,
Microsoft, you can very well use it in your production
absolutely.
and
Yes,
other
this is a
tenants.
production, still a private, public
Public
preview,
preview.
but it's officially supported and as any other public preview, and will go to GA. So
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, so it's very, very exciting time to see, the birth of like a new service from Graph to MCP. And I really like the part that admins have a lot of control over how it's getting deployed and they can use all the things they have today with conditional access and service principals and users and deciding who can do what. I think it's a good first step before it's suddenly like available to all sorts of clients and people to use. And as admins and Entra stakeholders, it's a good thing that you can start getting used to. And I think when you go up the level, like if you're an Entra, like a manager managing a whole team and you don't have time to write PowerShell scripts and things anymore, you can now easily use VS Code and plug this in, and things you had to ask someone to run a script, etc. You can now try to use
do
the
it
LLM
yourself.
to
Yes.
use it yourself and get the answer
And not just
instantly.
that, I think this is also very, very useful for developers that wants to learn about Microsoft Graph, wants to learn how to construct queries because this system, it will not just return data, it would also return the query that is used to return data. So if you
Yeah.
ask, hey, what's the query to do this? It would tell you in with a very reliable grounding data. So if you want to learn Microsoft Graph, I think this is the best way you can do it.
Yeah, I mean, I use it today that way because I build the zero trust assessment and I have the MCP added in my code because when we are testing things, etc., right? Like instead of using Graph Explorer, like I can reason through chat and try to make it run things and see the responses that come. A lot more natural way to interact. And then I can convert that to Graph PowerShell. But today I do that manually. Like, so in the future, once you add the PowerShell side of it, it'll be good when I start getting PowerShell and I can just plug that into my script. So I use it today to help write my script and, validate things using the MCP itself. So that's a neat way to just have that MCP on. And you never know, like sometimes when I have some issue with a tenant and I'm writing script and it doesn't work and I ask the LLM like, why is this PowerShell script giving this error? The LLM is able to, if I have that MCP enabled, the LLM is able to just call into that tenant and figure out, and then
Absolutely.
it tells me like it's because it's a data problem in this tenant, or it, like what the reason is, and then it's able to give suggestions to my script to improve it. So just by making it available to the LLM, it's like having someone else, and they suddenly like are thinking on their own and giving suggestions and trying it out. So even to write PowerShell scripts, it's a very powerful thing to have on the side if you're dealing with graph, because you can get to the right type of graph API query immediately.
Absolutely.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks so much, Luca. This was really fun. And yeah, we waited so long to record this one because we wanted to do it after
Yes.
we hit public preview. I need to bring you on for another day to talk all about why do we have this consistency level, eventual, and all this stuff in Entra? I think it's a good deep dive into how the underlying architecture is for graph and why things work one way and not the other and so on. So I want to bring you on. Maybe in the future we'll
Happy to
do one to
yes.
talk all about that. Cool. Thanks so much.
All right, Nair.
See you.
Thank you for having me here.
Cheers.